Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started here in just 1 minute. Hang in tight. Okay, hello, everyone. We're just going to go ahead and get started. My name is Ryan Girardin, and I am part of the Guardify outreach team based here in Denver, Colorado. Now, before we get going, we just want to extend a big thank you for joining us for our webinar, When Children Are There, Responding to Domestic Violence Calls with Children in the Home. We're so glad that you're here. Now, we typically like to start each webinar by briefly sharing who Guardify is, especially for those who may be joining us for the first time or perhaps seeing something new from us. Guardify is a secure cloud-based platform that supports child advocacy centers, law enforcement agencies, prosecution offices, and hospital-based entities. We provide case management and evidence management tools that help teams securely manage all types of digital evidence and case documentation and reporting without having to rely on DVDs, flash drives, paper files, or outdated systems. And your work is truly at the heart of why Guardify exists. These webinars are only one way we try to support that work by creating space for experienced professionals to share their knowledge and provide practical training that can be taken back into a daily practice. Okay, just some quick housekeeping notes before we turn everything over to our presenter. Number one, if you would like a copy of the presentation slides today, you can access them by using the link in the chat box below. Number two, please be on the lookout for an email later this afternoon that will also explain how you can complete the evaluation form and also receive your certificate. And then lastly, if you have any questions during the presentation, we encourage you to submit them in the Q&A box below. Okay, we would like you to all be aware of some very exciting upcoming events and news. On March 26th, we are hosting another live webinar called Lessons from the Front Lines, Preventing Burnout for Healers and Helpers. Please be on the lookout for registration information. Also, have you checked out Guardify's Real Evidence podcast? Join Ashley and Myron as they explore how technology, people, and processes unite to reshape the landscape of justice and the community. Okay, and finally, we chose this topic because domestic violence cases involving children require a coordinated, trauma-informed approach. It provides officers, investigators, and prosecutors with practical guidance to better protect children, support victims, and strengthen case outcomes. And with that, finally, we're more than happy to turn everything over to Ashley, who will take a moment to introduce herself. Thanks so much, Ashley.
Thank you so much to you, Guardify team, for getting this put together, and also for all of you who are attending. I am really excited to dive into this topic with you guys today. So, my name is Ashley Holman. I am an assistant district attorney, and I serve as the chief of the 49th Judicial District Court in Kaufman County, Texas. Just a little bit of background. For those of you who don't know where Kaufman, Texas is, we're about 30 miles east of Dallas, Texas, in the DFW Metroplex. And so I like to refer to us as a little big county. We have, in the last 5 years, been one of the nation's fastest growing counties. And so prior to that, we were really rural. I have places in my jurisdiction that are more urban and houses are going up daily. It's booming. We have all kinds of new developments. But then on my way to work, I might still get stuck behind a tractor or have a cow that has gotten out of the gate. And so for those of you who may be in a similar situation, I wanted to kind of couch our talk today, understanding what kind of jurisdiction I actually work in. Because sometimes when you have these webinars or you talk about best practices or things that you can put in place, some of that can sound really good if you're coming from a big jurisdiction with lots and lots of resources. And so I want to talk about that before we dive in, but really give some context for the kind of place that I'm working. The other thing that is about to go out, you'll see a poll. I'd love to know who is attending with us today and kind of where your practice field is. So if you don't mind giving us an answer to that, and we'll get that information in just a second. For a large majority of the 10 years that I've been out here in Kaufman County, I have worked on intimate partner violence cases, as well as crimes against children. Back in 2019, our jurisdiction decided that we would actually create a specialized unit to handle domestic violence cases, particularly felonies at that time. And so my elected district attorney, Early Wiley, tapped me to help create that unit and get it started. And with that, now years later, we have developed that into what is called the Special Victims Division. I got to serve as the chief of that during my time, and now have transitioned into general felony and doing a little bit of everything. But I talked to you about that because really it's been that transition that has helped me, the people that I work with on a daily basis out here in Kaufman County, develop what we feel is a best practice in approaching these kind of cases. I hope today, as we talk, you take away, if you're a veteran at this and you've been doing it a really long time, I hope it gives you a renewed perspective, maybe about how you approach these cases. And if you are new to it, maybe you are a new caseworker, new at a CAC, new to prosecution or investigation or police work. I hope that these give you some tools in your toolkit to better approach these cases. One, for the victims of domestic violence, but also for these kiddos who are having to live in a home where domestic violence exists. So with that, uh, Melissa, do we have responses back on who's attending with us today?
Yeah, so it looks like we have about like 309 plus of child welfare, which is a huge amount. We have a whole bunch of advocates, family advocates, victim advocates, forensic interviewers, and law enforcement are kind of tied a little above 100, but mostly child welfare and victim and family advocates. That's amazing. Thank you guys.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you each, because I know you were all very busy. So with that, let's dive in. So our objectives for today, I hope throughout this presentation, we're going to discuss the realities of these types of cases, and some common assumptions that are made along kind of every step of the way, from the scene response to sometimes even if a case goes to CPS or doesn't go to Child Protective Services, and then even when it gets to the prosecutor's office. Some legal and investigative duties when children are involved. Again, for context, I'm in the jurisdiction of the state of Texas. And so a lot of what we do is based on the fact that we are governed by Texas and those statutes. I recognize that there are people attending today from all over. And so it is important to be familiar with your statutory guidelines and your statutory definitions for what constitute child abuse or neglect. But a lot of what we're going to talk about is generally just best practice when you're dealing with these kinds of cases. I hope you leave gaining practical guidance and tools for using an MDT approach. If you've been in the child welfare arena for any amount of time, we talk about a multidisciplinary team approach on anything related to crimes against children. What we have found, and I hope you're already doing in your jurisdiction, is using an MDT approach to effectively work cases that involve domestic violence, or that have kids who are witnessing intimate partner violence or having it committed on them. And so we'll talk about that. We're going to also discuss the real impact on prosecution when you do work in a team approach, and strategies for trial and witness prep. So assumptions versus realities. When I say this, these are assumptions that I think are made by our law enforcement who are responding to the scene, again, from people who are working these cases, but also assumptions sometimes even made by your victim. And so when I get a case file or I'm watching body cam on a domestic violence case, it is not uncommon for me to hear things like, well, he would never hurt the kids. And one other caveat before we jump in, you will hear me throughout this talk, again, for simplicity, may refer to a perpetrator as a he or a she. I say that really often. I say that only because a large majority of my cases involve male on female intimate partner violence. But let me just take a step back and recognize that absolutely we have and a growing number of male victims with female perpetrators. We also have same sex couples. There is not a one size kind of fits all to anything that involves intimate partner violence. And so, certainly, and you all know, we work all kinds of cases. But again, you will hear me say that often today in my examples. It tends to be the large majority of cases that I work. That he would never hurt the kids. They didn't see anything. They were asleep when this was happening. The kids were in their room. I think a lot of times when we hear those things said, officers on scene may even want to believe that. Maybe the advocates who are working these cases want to believe a victim when they say that, or they say it sincerely. I think victims sometimes even want to believe that their kids are not exposed to intimate partner violence or what's going on in their home as much as they probably are. It can also be born out of maybe more negative thoughts. They think if I tell them the kids were watching, the kids are probably going to tell them what's going on in the house. Or, what if my ex finds out that this has happened again and he comes and tries to take the kids away? Or this is just what I need. I'm in the middle of a custody battle. And so there are so many different motivations for why these things get said on a scene. But what we know and the reality is that most of the time, if there are children in a home and we have ongoing intimate partner violence, they are either hearing, seeing, have been a part of, or being exposed in some way to the atmosphere that is just the reality of a home that has intimate partner violence. I want to take a step before we get into the practical. I want to look at the numbers on this. So when we're talking about the reality of kids actually being involved, data really supports this. And so why do we want to approach with a best practice of actually approaching scenes in the way that makes sense? Well, data tells us that these kids are involved. So just a few statistics for you. 2 out of every 3 non-fatal victimizations, we're not talking about homicides, we're talking about assaults on a victim that were non-fatal, female intimate partners in the United States occur in the home. We have a large body of data, unfortunately, on homicides between intimate partners, but we're taking that aside for a second, and we are also looking at the non-fatal victimizations. And so 2 out of every 3 occurring in the home. This is a statistic out of the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia Center for Violence and Prevention. Self-reports by mothers who experienced intimate partner violence found that 44% of their children had been exposed to that intimate partner violence. And so again, this is based on self-reports of moms who experienced IPV. Research also suggests that in an estimated 30 to 60% of the families where domestic violence is identified, some form of co-occurring child maltreatment is also present. And this is actually out of the Alliance for Children, which is a fellow Texas organization doing great work in Tarrant County. So thank you for that. One of the things that I think we can't ignore as child protective services workers, police officers, prosecutors, is that the simple statement that the kids weren't involved or they didn't see anything really isn't backed up by the data. And so we also have to have our eyes open to, is this the only victim in this home when we're responding to a scene of domestic violence? Go on. 65% of adults that abuse their partner also have been found to physically or sexually abuse their children. This is based on decades of case study research. In 2023, a nationally estimated 2,000 children died from abuse and neglect in the US, with the highest mortality rates being in infants less than 1 year of age. I share that statistic with you because if any of you have had the unfortunate time in your career to have to work on a case involving a child death, particularly with our littles or infants, if you peel back the facts of that case, or have really dived in, I want you to think about how many of those had involved some form of intimate partner violence at any point against maybe a spouse or a partner in that home. And so, again, we have to be aware, especially of even the smallest children who may not be able to speak or undergo a forensic interview, and being really cognizant about looking into that when we approach a home. Um, so for our kiddos who are not physically assaulted in these situations, studies have found that children exposed to maternal intimate partner violence without experienced child maltreatment were 40% more likely to have behavioral problems than children not exposed to IPV. And so even for our kiddos who may not come under the purview of the Department of Family and Protective Services, or may not have something that equals child abuse or neglect, we can't ignore the fact that they're also affected if they're exposed to intimate partner violence, and what we can see the long-term effects of that are. If any of you are familiar with the ACEs studies, adverse childhood experience, I highly suggest that any practitioner, whether you're a law enforcement officer, prosecutor, or advocate in any space, go and look at that research. Before we jump out of the numbers, we've looked here, big picture out. We know that there are high instances of this happening in the home, also high instances where the children may be involved. But then let's look at to what extent. There is not a whole lot of recent data on this. So if anybody's looking at this or studying it or can point me to some, I would love it. But the last really comprehensive study we have of this was published in 2011. It was in conjunction with the Department of Justice. It was a national survey on children's exposure to intimate partner violence and also looking at the effects of that. In that survey, they found that 1 out of every 4 children had been exposed to at least one form of intimate partner violence in their lifetime. 90% of the kids who reported seeing violence as opposed to just hearing it. So 90% of the 1 in every 4 reported that not only did they hear it, they saw it. And this really astounded me. So in that same study, they took a sample size of 4,549 children. And these were kids who were interviewed, but also they talked to their caregivers. Again, we talked about 1 in every 4 of those kids who were surveyed had had some exposure to intimate partner violence. Then they went on to see even where they had exposure, did they engage in that intimate partner violence at all? So did they try to stop it? Did they intervene? What role at all was the child just a witness? Happened when that took place. And so I show you this where they found almost half of you surveyed reported yelling to try to stop the violence. 43.9% had tried to get away, and 23.6% had tried to call for help. And so, why do I tell you this? Well, I want us to take this as we go into the rest of the presentation and understand that the data really just doesn't support that the only people you have in the house are our victim and our perpetrator who may know that something's going on. Okay. The likelihood, if you have kiddos, once you respond, that they know something that is going to be of value to law enforcement or advocates in helping that family is really high. And we know that based on the statistics. So what does that mean for us? Well, I want to talk first to my law enforcement officers responding to that scene. As we talk about these next few slides, a lot of this is going to be generally just helpful for any response to a domestic violence scene. But again, we're focusing particularly when you have kiddos there and really identifying everyone in the home. So scene control versus evidence gathering. When officers are responding to these scenes, it's no secret, they're usually chaotic. Data also tells us that this is one of the most dangerous calls that officers go on, responding to a domestic disturbance or a family violence offense. That's just the reality. And so most officers are telling you when they get to that scene, they want to get order established. They want to get everything in control because it is chaos. some of the best evidence that I have ever received in a case, or really most telling evidence about how dangerous something was in those first seconds of an officer responding and seeing that victim or the children who are in that home on body cam. And so one thing that I tend to see officers do, and it comes from a good place, is they want to calm everyone down. They want to get everybody kind of de-escalated, get them calm, and then maybe they can go through what happened in a logical, chronological order. I want you to think about trying to avoid interrupting or stopping a victim from talking in those first moments. Why is that? Well, one, it's some of the best evidence that we have. Also, there's a good chance it's going to be admissible and fall under a hearsay exception later on at trial. And so those have been key pieces of evidence for us. Also, what do we know about the neurobiology of trauma? So once something traumatic has happened, usually, and my advocates here on this call and counselors can speak way better to this, but what we do know is that it's highly unlikely they're going to be giving you information in a chronological order. Their brain just can't do it yet. And so when we're stopping them, interrupting them, saying start from the very beginning, it really might be physiologically and psychologically something that your victim can't do. And so being able to capture some of those raw moments just initially upon arrival of the scene can be great evidence for us later on. And I've seen this not only with adult victims, but also our kiddos when we're first engaging with them. The time for calm will come. Obviously, scene safety is paramount, but don't be afraid to let them talk a little bit and really get that out. Then once we've decided that it's time for the calm, we've got people separated, we're ready to really dig in and do some investigation to see what's happened. We're going to want to identify all of those present in the home. And all of those present in the home currently, but also who regularly reside in the home. That's really important. And one of the ways I see this asked by officers is who saw this or did anyone else see this? I don't think it's enough if we stop there. And so I think it's important to say who all is present in the home. Because again, and it goes back to where we started, victims want to assume that their kids weren't exposed to this. And maybe it's not that they want to assume that, maybe they know that they were exposed to it and they don't want them involved. And so it's really important to take the extra step to just say who all is present in this home. We want names, we want dates of birth, we want schools, and we want places of employment for anybody who is in there. This is going to be really important later when we talk about building in bond conditions and protective orders on these types of cases, and also getting them linked with other services. We can't assume when we get there or take an adult's word for it that minor victims or other home members didn't hear the assault or have relevant information for law enforcement and prosecutors. And so it's very important to make sure that we've identified, again, all the parties at the home at the time of offense. And I did say too, who regularly reside there. I have had cases where prior to officers getting there, children have maybe been sent next door or had someone come pick them up really quickly so that they were not involved in the investigation at all. Sometimes that's born out of a good place of protection. Sometimes it's actually because they know a lot and in that information needs to be provided. Maybe there's already an open CPS case. We don't know, but it's important for us to get names, date of birth, and information on those kiddos to make sure that we're doing our due diligence there. So working with kids on scene, obviously every police officer who has a children's advocacy center in their jurisdiction and regularly refers people for forensic interviews has probably had it trained into them or scared into them. Don't talk to kids. I hear patrol officers say that so often on body cam. No, I won't be talking to the kids. We send them, we don't talk to kids, we send them to a professional. And that comes from a good place. It comes from a place of probably being yelled at by somebody about speaking to a kid on a body cam. So I understand. But when we're responding to a domestic violence case, we don't have that luxury to not do that. And really, I think we're missing an opportunity to gather really crucial information. And there's a way that we can do it without jeopardizing or compromising our investigation. One, when we're going to interact with those kids on scene, we want to do that away from the victim and the perpetrator. It, whether if you have a body cam, fantastic. Try to do that inside where that child is comfortable, in their own home, feeling in a place where we feel like they can feel comfortable and safe, right? If that's not available, and for whatever reason you're not wearing a body cam, try to find the front of a patrol unit, anything where we can get this actually recorded, okay? But we always want to make sure that they are not speaking right there with a victim and a perpetrator on a TV scene. We do not want that child to feel like in any way they're about to get anybody in trouble. Again, make sure a body cam is activated in a recording device. And I touched on it a second ago, to interview or not to interview. I need you to use your police and your human instincts, okay? Yes, the forensic interview is the gold standard. And I am going to be talking here in a second about how any opportunity we have to get those kiddos into a forensic interview, we need to. But we have to have a basic understanding that night of what's going on. I think a lot of officers fear, one, probably from being yelled at previously, but also comes from really not understanding what a forensic interviewer actually does. We take for granted in this space that we sort of all know everybody's titles. Well, that's a CPS worker, that's a forensic interviewer, that's a counselor, that's an investigator, that's the prosecutor. But do we all actually understand the role that each of us has in getting any sort of case through the criminal justice system? And so I challenge you guys to, especially starting at your patrol level, make sure that everyone understands the role of each member on the team. And so equipping your patrol officers who regularly respond to domestic violence calls and regularly respond to maybe even outcries of child abuse. And I've seen this across patrol officers and investigators who couldn't adequately articulate what is the role of that person. They don't have to have an intimate knowledge, but really understanding what's going to happen once that person gets there can help us connect victims to resources a lot more effectively. And here's what I mean by that. When you understand what a forensic interviewer does and how they do their job, it then helps you understand what your limitations are. And so I'm not suggesting that officers conduct a full forensic interview on scene. But what an officer could take away from understanding the role of a forensic interview is the basic thing of building rapport. So if you are there interacting with a child on scene, again, make sure they're comfortable. Try to get down on their level. Start with some basic questions. What's your name? How old are you? Do you go to school? What's your favorite color? Those are all things that our forensic interviewers do beautifully during a forensic interview to build rapport. They're things that humans can just do, and police officers on a scene to help that kiddo feel comfortable. Always be a calm presence. Reassure them that they've done nothing wrong, and that police are there just to make sure that they and their home is safe. And again, we harp on, we don't want people talking to kids because we don't want leading questions. Well, I think our patrol officers are capable of just saying, what happened? I had a perfect example of this. I had a case come through one time with a little boy who is probably about 4 years old. He's in his PJs, cute as a button, just kind of there on scene that night. And it really hadn't been fettered out what, if any, role he had in this domestic violence incident up to that point. All the officer did was sort of bend down and say, buddy, are you doing okay? And the little boy just, again, it was so sad, but cute as could be, said, it was really scary when daddy was hitting mommy. she was holding me and she almost dropped me. That officer didn't ask a leading question. He was just human. And so that was a really powerful moment on that body cam. And who's going to argue that that kid was coached in that moment? It was raw, it was powerful. And so again, I think sometimes we're so scared to interact with kids on scene because it's been ingrained with us to forward them on to our forensic interviewers. Also photograph the child. You may capture it on body cam. If you need to take a still photograph, sometimes kiddos are very scared. It is clear that they've been crying or screaming. Hopefully they have no injuries for maybe being a part of an assault. What is also equally sad and terrifying is when you've responded to a scene where the house is in disarray. It's clear that glasses have been broken. There may even be blood because of a violent assault that clearly took place. And you have kiddos who are calm and look completely unaffected. And I would say take a picture of that too, because it is equally powerful later on and heartbreaking to jurors because we know that that's probably not the first time that they saw that. Once children and other parties have given statements, I think it's really important before you leave that scene for patrol officers to do a video walkthrough, either with your body cam or visually document the layout of that home with photos. Again, going back to, we want to know exactly the layout of that house. We might not have another opportunity later on through the prosecution or with your investigator, your CID division to actually get that layout. This may be our only chance. But it's really important later to, for the context of, was that kiddo's room right next to mom and dad's room? How close was this fight to them? And again, is the house in disarray? Are there broken dishes everywhere? Is there blood spatter? But having that full layout, I think, can be really powerful for jurors, whether or not it's just one, they expect to see it in case in chief, but also may lead to other arguments later on about punishment and the effect of this in the home. This seems like a very sort of common sense thing, but I think one of the things that makes or breaks a case for prosecution, or really makes or breaks whether or not a victim's going to be cooperative, is how supportive they feel that night and equipped with information, and really what happens in those moments and days just after. You know, I talked about when you first arrive on scene, those moments with your body cam can be the most telling. They're scared. They want it to stop. They need help right away, right? And so they're telling you exactly how they feel. Go through the crime scene. Sometimes you'll notice even before you leave the scene that maybe they're becoming a little less cooperative. Usually officers are, you know, explaining to them these are the next steps, but I think it's so important to be very clear with our victims what is going to happen from there on out and what resources are available to them. Sometimes I have victims who have reached out and maybe didn't understand that a protective order was issued that next morning or was going to be issued, or blind conditions. Again, as officers, we can't overlook those details, and connecting them to those resources. They may never avail themselves to them. Let me be clear about that. They may be telling you to get off their lawn before you even finish filling out the affidavits or your report. But at least give them the opportunity, give them the chance to take the resources. Okay. And so I think that we have to be very clear about what is available to them. If they are concerned about them getting out that night, talk to them about the emergency protective order that you're going to be filing for. If they still don't feel safe in that home that night, connect them with the emergency resources that are in your area. Again, this could be the first step to making sure that they'll stay the course. Okay. Protective orders, I can't harp on them enough. Here in our jurisdiction, it is pretty much automatic on a family violence offense that you're going to have an emergency protective order that is applied for by law enforcement. I always tell officers this, if they're ever on the fence about filing a protective order that night, well, did you believe there was probable cause that family violence occurred? Well, if we believe that family violence occurred, why would we not seek a protective order? And I am unapologetic about that. Even when someone is maybe saying, I don't know that I need it. That night, if probable cause existed and you believed that family violence occurred in that home, no one is going to be hurt by a protective order. Okay. We can sort the rest out later. Also, in our jurisdiction, bond conditions are very common. And so the benefit of that is that emergency protective orders have timelines. Bond conditions can last the duration of the pending criminal charge. And so oftentimes magistrates will put that in place so that, we have that backstop if they believe it warrants it in a family violence offense. And why is this so important to have the children included in the protective order? Well, one, are they members of the home? Yes. Are we telling this person that they don't need to have contact with our victim or they cannot go within 200 yards of the home? Yes. And so I have had at different points, maybe officers say, well, I don't know that I need to include the children. Well, one, if we don't include the children, I can guarantee to you we're including the children because if those kids are not put in that protective order, we have now no sort of safety plan for our victim or backstop for them to prevent like the perpetrator from just picking up those kids. He has every legal right to them. And so that protective order gives them the ability to say, here elementary school or daycare, he is not supposed to be picking them up. When we leave victims unequipped with that, again, in those fresh moments of responding to a family violence assault, we're missing a really key component of safety planning. And it's then when they end up in my office, maybe trying to apply for a different kind of protective order, or you may see them with legal aid trying to figure out how they can set up a SAPSER to file for child custody because we've left them without that. And so it is important in those moments to include the children. If a judge wants to modify that later, then so be it. There's a time and an arena for that. But in those initial moments, we're going to be including those kids in that protective order. Again, I talked about interviewing kids on scene. A forensic interview is the gold standard. I think another poll is going to go out here to you all. And I would love to just get your feedback and make sure, does your jurisdiction have access to a trained forensic interviewer for referral of these types of cases? And so I think historically we have always thought about the forensic interview being for our cases that involve maybe direct child physical abuse or sexual abuse. But forensic interviews are built for really child witnesses of crime. And just simple as that, it is for a child who is either a victim or a witness of crime. And so if you have kiddos on scene who have seen any part of that domestic violence, they are absolutely eligible and able to be forensically interviewed. And again, that is the gold standard. If you as an officer ask them, and again, I encourage you to ask them what happened, if you gather information on scene, that's great. I still think it's important to refer them for that forensic interview. Here in our jurisdiction, what you will see often is that these cases are responded to by a patrol officer. That victim is left with a report number, and then they may or may not be contacted by a criminal investigator, depending on the severity of the case. And so it is really important to be direct with them. If you do not believe they're going to be set up or contacted with a forensic or a criminal investigator, then you reach out to your Children's Advocacy Center about a forensic interview. or make sure that there is someone who's assigned to reach out for that forensic interview. I know, and I'm speaking on forensic interviewers in my jurisdiction, they want to be notified. Sometimes that notification, and we can talk about it here in the next couple of slides, is made by CPS. Sometimes CPS is setting up that forensic interview. But again, thinking about that multidisciplinary approach, someone needs to make sure that that is done and communicate very directly with the victim as you're leaving the scene, that someone's going to be in contact about that, and letting them know who that point person is going to be. And then,
So
Melissa, do we have responses on that question?
it looks like mostly everybody said yes, but there are a couple that said no. So out of the 839 people that responded, 804 said yes, and then 35 said no.
Okay. So for those that said no, feel free to send questions when we get to that portion too. But again, that goes back to if you just don't have a CAC that conducts those forensic interviews near you, making sure that your officers have some sort of training of how to actually talk to that kiddo on scene. And then if it's that you do have a children's advocacy center and maybe those aren't the type of cases that have been referred over, or you're not sure if those meet protocol, I really encourage you to reach out to them and y'all have a sit down as an MDT, because maybe it's the time to start. And so thank you everybody for that feedback. Okay, notification of CPS. So there are not every victim of domestic violence is a bad parent at all. This does not mean that kids need to be removed from a parent who has been a victim of domestic violence. I shouldn't have to say that, but sometimes I think that people really do question the idea that we're going to contact CPS in some instances where domestic violence has occurred. So let me start there, right? Not every case is appropriate for referral, but I would argue that a lot more than we think should be being referred to CPS. Okay. And I think why this breakdown happens is because, again, going back to not understanding every role of the team, sometimes, and I've talked to officers candidly about this, they think, well, I don't want to report them. They're not a bad mom. I don't want to get them in trouble with CPS. There's an idea that the only reason reports or referrals go to CPS is because somebody's in trouble. And they always sort of associate that with their victim or the maternal figure being in trouble. And so I want to dispel that notion right now. And also for us to understand, I just saw some of the reaction there. Yes, yeah. And so I want to dispel that and again, encourage us to, you're adding members to your team. Because again, the reality is that we cannot do this all. I, as the prosecutor, cannot be the victim advocate, the counselor, the interviewer, and you patrol officers can't either. But the thing is that these cases aren't going away. They're filling up your call sheets. They're filling up my docket buckets. They are filling up our CACs. And if we don't do something about it, and for the kids who are affected, unfortunately, they're going to be filling up also our criminal justice system or other places if we don't intervene. And so I want us to be more open to understanding when we need to bring these cases into the purview of Child Protective Services. You may make that referral and it may go nowhere. You may make that referral and that family is then connected with family-based services to offer them resources and assistance. You may make that referral and find that actually there's a lot more going on here, and that caregiver or both caregivers have no business actually having this child in their custody right now. I've seen every version of that. And so notification of CPS where appropriate. I really do think that these cases are made and break on a proper referral and a thorough referral. And that really can't happen unless you give CPS the right information. And so, officers, you need to take note of any details provided to you during that investigation. I reference here a lethality assessment or a family violence supplement. So in our jurisdiction, most of our law enforcement officers, when they investigate a case involving family violence and or strangulation, there is a family violence supplement, and it is meant to not only address the night in question here, but also to peel back, do we have prior family violence offenses that have occurred, prior threats, access to weapons, or threats against other members of the household or pets? I have provided a link that's going to be going out to you guys. It's just a sample of what we use here. There are so many different ones that are passed around in different jurisdictions. You may have something that's referred to as a lethality assessment or a family violence supplement. But I highly encourage you to make sure that your patrol officers are equipped with this. One, they have so many things that they're thinking about when they arrive on a scene. This makes it a little more comprehensive as a checkbox. Officers are good with those check boxes. Have I hit these markers, those kinds of signs? And so it will help them not only in their report writing later, but also making sure that we've left no stone unturned. Again, because this may be our only opportunity to gather that information. What I see a breakdown of is when that CPS referral is made, officers, you're going to be the ones calling it in usually because you're the one leaving the scene with that information. You need to make sure that you've shared any information that you've learned in that lethality assessment or that family violence supplement with your CPS referral. Why is that so important? Well, if you just do a referral based on the assault that night, there's one set of information. But what if in the family violence supplement, that victim has let you know that there's been 3 other prior assaults in the last year? CPS workers, just think to yourself, would that make a difference to you about how you need to monitor this case or approach this family? Yeah. Was this a one-time event? Well, no, we know it wasn't. Maybe it was the first time it was reported. And so it's important that your CPS worker has access to that information so they can make an informed approach about how to protect these kiddos. Also note any concerns that you have for victim safety or contact with the offender. If you leaving that scene believe in any way that that offender is going to be back in the home or has access to those kids in any way, or there's something about that setup, you need to communicate that in your referral. Again, it's giving that CPS worker, when they get that intake, clear eyes on the background and the dynamics of this case. It's also going to help them understand, what are the barriers for this victim? We know that there's so many different things. Maybe it's monetary, maybe it's prior threats and just how much violence has occurred. The children always are a factor. We can think of so many prior threats or engagement with law enforcement. The CPS looking at as their prior CPS history. We need to know that going in so that we don't sort of write off a case or close a case very early on at intake that maybe we don't think needs more services, because we don't know that unless we look at the full picture. Also notify CPS of any protective orders that are being sought or are already in place. So if you intend as an officer to, send an application for emergency protective order into the magistrate when that offender is booked in, please let them know that in the referral, because a lot of times I will, get calls maybe after a case is filed where CPS is wanting to know what kind of bond restrictions or protective orders are actually in place so that they can navigate, advising both the offender as well as the protective parent in the case, how they need to go about services or what they can and can't do. And so making sure your CPS worker is fully informed there. And then on the other side of that, when these cases are, still open, active, being investigated, for my criminal investigators at police agencies, use your CPS workers. I have found a treasure trove of evidence and gold that came from the fact that a CPS worker had to go out on an intake on a case. A lot of investigators don't understand that this information is available to you. And in our jurisdiction, really can be as simple as a phone call because we have the benefit, and I'll talk about in a second, of how close our MDT works together. But also request that investigative narrative. In some jurisdictions, you're going to have to subpoena those documents. We do here in my DA's office have to subpoena that full case file. But a lot of times in these cases, your CPS worker is not only identifying the victim or interviewing the victim in your case, that CPS worker has probably screened those kids and talked to them. They have also may have conducted an interview with the defendant. And so I have learned so much information about what may have took place, or a new version of events that maybe weren't given on scene by the different parties, by looking at those records and being in sync with your CPS worker who's also working that case. It's nothing worse than sending a case to our office and having your name on it as the lead investigator, and then coming to court and all of the simultaneous investigation having been done by CPS and then not being aware of that. That's a defense attorney's daydream. How thorough was your investigation? Did you not look at what CPS did? We get that a lot from defense attorneys, especially out here in our jurisdiction, who know how readily available that information is. And so doing a thorough job as a criminal investigator, and as a prosecutor for that matter, is being aware of what was disclosed in all of those areas. I really don't think that you can effectively investigate or prosecute a case unless you have reviewed all of that information. And understand that cases that may not start with a CPS referral may go there at some point in your case because of information that you learn, or new cases, unfortunately, that happen if a perpetrator's been allowed to go back to their residence, or maybe violates an order and goes back to their residence, even without being allowed by a victim. So I'm going to run through this next section a little bit quickly because I want to be cognizant of our time here. But some common case scenarios that I think some may seem really straightforward for you, of yes, I would definitely notify CPS in that instance. And then some that may not seem as common, but are all scenarios that prosecutors in our office commonly make a referral to CPS for. One, child was being held while mom was assaulted. That's a no-brainer. Officers, if you arrive on that scene and that is a circumstance, we need to be making sure that a CPS referral was made. After assaulting mom, perpetrator tells her if he can't have her in his family, then no one will. And if she leaves, he'll kill her and the children. In the state of Texas, threats of violence are also defined in the family code as family violence. And so keying into that and being aware of it, and that goes back to our family violence supplement. There's actually a section in that supplement that asks about prior threats. You may learn of that threat in that supplement once filling it out. It may not be in your victim's affidavit. And so, again, being aware of all the information you've gathered on scene, using that to make a judgment about making that CPS referral, and also connecting CPS to that information. Scenario 3, father is waving a gun towards mom, throwing plates across the room. Children are not harmed, but are in and out of the room while this takes place. This goes back to, again, really looking at the definition of what child abuse or neglect is in your jurisdiction. And so do we have exposure to the potential for bodily injury here? Well, yeah, if you're throwing glass and plates across a room in a rage, in a domestic violence situation, and the kids are there, then yeah, in that case, again, it may not go anywhere past our referral, but that is a situation where we're going to call that in. Victim is initially cooperative and CPS closes their investigation. You receive information that the perpetrator is back in the home and driving the kids to daycare with an EPO in place. I've had this case. And for our office, there was an active emergency protective order active bond conditions that these kids were protected parties. This person was not to have any contact with them. Our school law enforcement saw him doing the drop off morning after morning, noticed, pulled up the protective order because those are entered into TCIC in our jurisdiction, and called in the report. Number 5, police are called out to the home of a domestic violence victim for a second assault. The children were not present for defendant's first arrest. However, they are now. So this, again, it goes back into that first arrest. CPS may not have been called. The kids weren't there. A referral may not have been made. But now what we have is law enforcement's responding to multiple domestic violence situations, and we have kids who are present for that DV. That's something that I would highly suggest an officer make a referral for. You learn through jail calls that not only were the children in the home the night of the assault, they heard and saw the assault and were told not to say anything. We may have more than just a CPS referral. We may even have a criminal offense at this point, but that's totally separate. But again, this is indicating to us that now we have child witnesses who may have information, and we're going to need to circle back if a referral wasn't made there, and or connect them to our forensic interviewer. And the final one, you learn that through interviewing your child witness that last year defendant shoved them into a wall when they tried to get them, the defendant off of mom. The police were never called in that instance. And so this is, again, one of those examples of a case may not start with a referral to CPS, but you may learn information along the way that requires you to link up with CPS and or link them to your child advocacy center. And so I think it's just important to kind of skip that out. And again, talk as a team. Have you come across these? What are you currently doing? And do we need to really reevaluate what kind of cases we're sending in? So the value of the MDT approach. Again, when I use MDT, I know most of you are all familiar with what I mean by that. Again, this is just a helpful little graphic of who all's involved, but this is a no-brainer when it comes to cases that involve sexual abuse against a child or or physical abuse against a child, but we don't think of it as often when we're talking about child witnesses or kids who are exposed to intimate partner violence. I am fortunate enough in my jurisdiction that, one, we have a children's advocacy center that is happy to interview kiddos who have witnessed crime or have been exposed to domestic violence in a criminal offense. And so those cases are commonly referred by protocol to our children's advocacy center. And that interview is either set up by a police officer who has responded to the scene, an investigator who's taken over that case, or our CPS worker once they've been looped in. I think that sometimes we forget that a forensic interview is going to be able to filter out lots of information that maybe a child wasn't ready to talk about on scene, wasn't asked a question that would have led to that information, or maybe we didn't even think was pertinent at that time. And so the other part of getting them to our Children's Advocacy Center and under the purview of our multidisciplinary team is I want us to think about all the people we've now brought in the sphere or added to our team of people who can help move this case forward. And we're not just adding them for the child. These people are also going to be working in step or trying to with our adult victim so that they understand that they have resources. And so we have our forensic interviewer, obviously our investigator, our prosecutor, our law enforcement, medical, if necessary, mental health advocates, and victim advocacy. Again, in our office specifically, we have our prosecutors who handle these specialized cases. We also are fortunate enough to have victims assistance coordinators, and we have coordinators who are specialized to crimes against children as well as family violence. And so they are working very closely with the advocates who are also under the umbrella of our Children's Advocacy Center. And I think that that's so important because a lot of times they're talking to these families or receiving information on a much more frequent basis than maybe you are as a prosecutor. And so being able to rely on your team members for that data of what's going on right now with this kiddo. Are they in therapy? Has offender been calling? All of the little things that you know can shape a case from one day to the next. We have more members of the team because, again, I can't do it on my own. Law enforcement can't do it on their own. And it takes all of us to get those services. So once we have gotten them under the purview of the Advocacy Center, again, whether by our officer or CPS worker, or our lead investigator or our prosecutor, if we find that it has not been sent over, our office is going to make those referrals. Then hopefully we're going to get a forensic interview set up of that child witness. So value of the forensic interview, you guys know this, but particularly as it relates to our family violence offense. Hopefully we're going to get details not only from that night, but also from before or after the assault. A prime example of this, I had a case where 3 kiddos ranging in age from about 8 to 15 were residing in a home with their mom and dad. Police are called out. Mom has actually been stabbed in the arm by father. And one of the children was actually our 911 caller who gets help and witnessed the assault herself. She is naturally interviewed as a witness to that domestic violence, but law enforcement in this case went a step further and actually had the 2 kiddos who on scene did not necessarily say they saw the assault happen, had them forensically interviewed. And what we learned from one of the children who was interviewed is what was taking place all that day. The defendant in that case had already kind of showed his cards. He had said that she had stabbed herself and that she was trying to basically become a victim of DV so that she could get a U visa. That's what he was claiming. And so had we not interviewed those kids, one, it would have been this victim of domestic violence, saying what happened versus the defendant in court, right? And so law enforcement did a great job. They sent all of those kids to the Children's Advocacy Center. And what we learned from one of the kiddos who didn't actually see the assault, but saw everything that led up that day. And she talked about how mad their dad was that mom would not drive him to the store to buy more beer, and how that commonly happened in their house because he liked to drink and he would yell. And sometimes they would fight with hands and words. And that was one of those cases where having that contextual information about, now we know defendant is upset. And why is he upset? Well, she won't drive him to the store to get more beer. And that this isn't uncommon in their house for him to yell and them to fight. And then the teenager's interviewed, and he talks about how he didn't see the assault, but the reason he didn't come out of his room was because honestly, there's always so much yelling by his dad in their home. The yelling really didn't clue him in that anything different was happening that day. He didn't come out of his room until a little bit later, and what he sees is blood spatter, and he witnesses the aftermath. He sees blood spatter, he actually sees the weapon, and then he also observes his dad trying to clean it up. And so that ended up being key details in our case. Again, he wasn't a witness directly to the assault itself, but he's a witness to the aftermath of it. And again, these corroborative details that corroborate what the mother is saying happened in that offense and negate the story that our defendant is giving now that he's been arrested and we're headed to a trial. So I say that to say you never know what you're going to get out of those forensic interviews, but they're never going to hurt. It's also going to give corroborative timelines. Kids, time is a funny thing with kids. But if there are other little things about the day that we can build our adult victim up as a truth teller, with how the case came to be, what they were doing leading up, just like the case I just gave you of dad being mad all day and yelling. That's really important. The information on family dynamics, we just talked about that. Kiddos will often also disclose history of abuse in the home. And so if maybe you didn't learn on scene about an extended history of abuse, maybe your victim was a little bit more closed off about that, then you may learn that from the kiddo. Also, sometimes victims have no idea that their kids actually have seen or witnessed much more than we think. And so being able to get that child's perspective of what it's like in that house is really important. I've even had kiddos remember some instances of assault family violence that our adult victim didn't even remember. And when we maybe bring it up later in a prep or something like that, they look shocked because they totally forgot about it because it was so common. The other very important thing, and again, this goes back to the statistics we talked about at the beginning of the training, is that screening for abuse to that child or any other siblings. And so your forensic interviewer is going to be trained to ask those important questions about, figuring out whether or not we have a victim here and, body safety, all of those things. Again, just to make sure that we don't have another victim in that home. Another thing that our Children's Advocacy Center staff was sharing with me and even preparing for this talk was that Children's Advocacy Center of Texas now has like a pre-interview screening sheet. It's a pre-interview screening tool. And also what that does, it's given before the interview, but it may ask questions about feelings or sort of more of a mental health component of things that child may have experienced or felt that they may not readily disclose in a forensic interview. Obviously, we understand there are times where we may not get all of the information, even in a really well done forensic interview. And so this is a screening that's taking place beforehand for advocates there at the Children's Advocacy Center to gather more information about that kiddo. And so I urge you as an MDT to also pay attention to that screening sheet, because again, that may be where we see some of the effects of what this child has been exposed to and how it's affecting them on a mental emotional level. Again, I think this also plays into our post advocacy for the family. When you get them under the umbrella of the Children's Advocacy Center, we now have referrals that can be made for counseling. Maybe it's right there in that center. Maybe it's outsourced to another agency that has a connection there. But we just can't underestimate all the power we have right there at our Children's Advocacy Centers for these kids. And I think about all the MDTs that I have sat on, and we always have a docket sort of all the cases, the kiddos who are seen, and so many of them witness to DV. And in our MDT, we staff those with every member of the MDT just as we would any other case. And as I was preparing for this talk with you, I just kept thinking how grateful I am that that is the practice in my jurisdiction. And I hope it is for yours too, because valuable information is shared when we're all in that room together. And then ultimately, this is really powerful for our plea negotiations. A case that may have just started with a statement from our victim and the defendant seems like a classic domestic violence case. Defense attorneys do not like to see a sweet little kiddo in a forensic interview disclosing all these details coming because they know that forensic interviews, one, juries value it. They know how well our forensic interviewers and our experts testify out here. And the idea that we may be having this kiddo end up testifying about what they saw or heard is really powerful for trying to get a resolution on a case. As a prosecutor, we never want to have to put a kiddo in court, right? I wish that we could shield them from that. I wish I could just hit play on the forensic interview, but I know that that's not the reality. What I also know is in cases where we have not effectively worked with this family and gotten that information from the children in the beginning, we are kidding ourselves if we think that the defense is not going to do that. And so we're not helping anybody or shielding kiddos from not bringing them under this purview and getting that information as an investigative tool. I have seen the other side of that where defense counsel has actually talked to them and or the defendant has used them sort of as a pawn throughout the case duration. And so I feel much more comfortable bringing them in the purview of our advocates and the people who are trained to do this and want to see the good for this family, than leaving it to a defense attorney to spin a story later of what that might look like. And so I think sometimes the pushback about even involving those kiddos in this process maybe comes from a well-meaning place, but it really just isn't the reality. And so we need to serve them well with the resources that we have available to us. Again, I just wanted to highlight why is it important for our kiddos who are exposed or a witness to DV. This is, again, just a helpful chart of some of those things that we may see based on age range of just exposure to IPV. And again, refer back to the data of how common that is, 1 in every 4 kiddos. And so these are all signs and things that we have advocates who are equipped to handle. And so we want to get them connected to those resources. And again, any of you who have worked in the criminal justice system, we want to address these issues before later into adulthood they become things that are much more serious, much more severe. The earlier we can intervene and get them assistance, I think that we owe it to them to do that. So receiving the case at the district attorney's office, one of the things that we have to do as prosecutors here is once we've read a set of facts that we believe should have been referred to CPS, we need to confirm that there's a reference number in that case file, and that an appropriate report has been made. I've had times where that hasn't happened, and so we need to first be addressing that if it did not. And then if it, again, hoping it has, we need to be aware of the records that need to be requested there. And so prosecutors, you've got to give yourself enough time to get those here in Texas. Again, I have to subpoena those records for the full case file, and that takes a tremendous amount of time. And so this is not something we need to be doing last minute. In our case, it's really something that if you can, trying to do that at intake. Review the report for child witnesses and their info. Again, we've had situations where it's not readily clear that a kiddo was there. And so I didn't really learn until the body cam that we had children in the home, and they really weren't a part or an active part of the report or the investigation. And so if you have identified child witnesses that, again, have not been forensically interviewed, really aren't referenced in the report, you're going to have to do some back work of getting that kiddo under the purview of either to a forensic interview or, again, having them to your office to do an interview with you, an investigator, and a victim's advocate, because we can't just kind of close our eyes to it and pretend like that's not going to come up in trial. So often I have had defense attorneys, say, well, this other person lived in the house. If this big assault was going on, wouldn't they have heard something? An investigator, a prosecutor, you never want to be in the middle of trial, and that's the argument. Children witnesses who are there are no different than us not interviewing someone who could have seen something, a neighbor, a passerby, on any other kind of criminal matter. We can't just close our eyes to it because they're kiddos, and we want to shield them from that. Again, we want to make sure that we're addressing it because it's happened. And so how can we go about that in the best way? Making sure that we've seen whether or not the kids are subject to the protective order or conditions of bond as a protected party. And so we need to be aware of that and make sure that that documentation is in order, especially because, I've had instances where victims have come to the office to file an A&P and the perpetrator was with them. I need to know whether or not those other children in their home are subject to that protective order, and he's not supposed to be around them. It's already a violation if he's with her. But also understanding whether or not our victim is maybe allowing him back in the home. Because again, whatever motivations are there, if that's happening, it may be something that we need to be looping Child Protective Services into. do we have follow-up forensics that need to be scheduled? I've talked through this. And have they been offered any services? Prosecutors, um, yes, usually there is an amount of time that has passed before you're looking at that case file on your desk. But you cannot assume that they have had resources made available to them. And so I think it's so important to lean on your victims assistance coordinators, and you guys work as a team to understand what's our policy when a case like this comes in. What are some instant pieces of information that we can get into the hands of our victim? I'm so grateful for our advocates here in our office. Before I even see the case file, they have been contacted by a victims assistance coordinator, and there is very set information that is going out to them. And they are inquiring about whether or not there are counseling referrals that need to be made, or any sort of advocacy on that front. They also have established a very good rapport with the advocates at our Children's Advocacy Center to make sure we're all in lockstep about how we can serve this family as a whole as that case moves through. Again, I've touched on subpoenaing these investigative records. And if you have determined that there is a child witness and that the role that they have played in this case, whether it is they have here in Texas, it's called 38371 information. So that's like contextual information about the relationship. Or maybe they were an eyewitness to the assault, or unfortunately, maybe they were a victim of domestic violence themselves by that perpetrator at some point in time. You need to be really clear early on about what, if any, role that child is going to play in your case and start building rapport early. Nothing upsets me more or makes me shudder more than the idea or hearing about a case where a prosecutor met a kiddo victim or a kiddo witness just before trial and got them prepped up just a few days before. We try very hard in our office to identify that early on, and to set up a meeting early on to just have that child, if they're going to be a witness, come to the office, and to be very clear with our victim about what the expectations are. One of the things I think that leads into even an adult victim being non-cooperative is they don't understand the process. They have no reason to trust us, right? And sometimes they seem even more trusting of the abuser than us, and we take for granted sometimes that can be off-putting to a prosecutor. Sometimes it's, well, they're not invested, they don't care about their case. But it couldn't be further from the truth. They would rather stick with what they know than what they don't. And so you have to take the time as a prosecutor to build rapport with them. I don't sugarcoat it for them. I let them know early on in the process, you may not like everything I have to tell you, but I am going to be direct with you and honest with you. And my main priority is your safety and the safety of your kids. Very direct, very respectful. I'm not judging her decisions or his decisions about, whether or not they want to still have a relationship with someone who has abused them. Okay. That's not my role. That's not my place. But my role is encouraging them that they deserve to live in a home where abuse doesn't occur, and that it's not okay, and that we need to have safety plans in place for them, but also their children. I have found that a lot of times victims care the most when they realize how affected their children are by intimate partner violence. It is sometimes a hard realization for them to come to, but at some point it really does start to click for them. And so you have to build that rapport early. It's not something that is developed by just one phone call or subpoenaing them to trial a few weeks before. You have to put the work in. Preparing that child to testify. So if you do determine that you're going to be calling that child to the stand, and you haven't worked with child witnesses or victims extensively, I really encourage you to take the time, or maybe even tap a prosecutor or your forensic interviewer about getting ready to work with that kiddo. We always do a rapport building meeting. We have a meeting here at our office. It's very short, usually about 30 minutes, where that kiddo will come to our office, and we do not talk about the hard stuff. All we do is we introduce ourselves to them, and explain our role And we explain to them that when they come to our office, their only job is to tell the truth. And they don't have to worry about what they tell us or making us happy, making their mom, their dad, anybody happy. Their only job is to tell the truth. And that at some point we'd like to talk to them. We learn about their favorite colors, their school, all of those things. And then we let them know that there's going to be a time where they have to come back and we have to talk about the hard stuff. And so we do that with our child witnesses as well as our child victims. And I think that it goes a long way. I realize that some of you, that may not be possible. You may not have an opportunity to do that. And so please know that I recognize that. And if you don't, do the best you can with what you have. And so again, try to build in that rapport building meeting along with then talking about those things. Maybe couple it with a tour of the courtroom. We always do a tour of the courtroom before a kiddo hits the stand. Because again, a courtroom sounds like a big, scary thing for a child. And so we like to do a visit. We like for them to go in. We walk the same hallway that they're going to walk to get to where they're going to testify. We include our victims assistance coordinator in that walk, as well as our investigator. A lot of times, child witnesses are very scared or worried about seeing the person who maybe committed the assault. Or maybe they love that person very much. And so we always ask when they're in the courtroom, how are you feeling? So that we can kind of vet out what emotions might be at play there, right? We are, again, reminding them, even when they sit in that chair to practice in the courtroom, that your only job is to tell the truth. We let them know who's on their team and who will be there for them and what role everyone plays. And we remind them that in that room, they're safe. And so, again, I think this is all stuff that is standard for when we're dealing with kids who are victims in child abuse cases, but often is overlooked when we're talking about working with our kids who are witnesses to the domestic violence. And so we can't underestimate how important that prep is. Okay. Also explain to them what you're going to be asking them, what cross-examination may look like. And then you as a team make a plan for courthouse safety and security. Is this defendant on bond? Are they going to be in the hallway? Because if that's the case, we don't want that child or our domestic violence victim walking into the courthouse at the same time as our defendant. We make arrangements for an investigator to meet them in the parking lot. Those little things can go such a long way to making sure that for the duration that that family's here, that we have made them feel safe and comfortable in getting ready to testify. Also, on the flip side, if you have a victim who's really not cooperative with you, but you do have a child testifying in your case, having extra investigators from your office around to make observations about any sort of interactions in the hallway is defense or the defendant talking to your child witness, those kinds of things. And so we want to try to prevent that as much as possible and really be aware of the dynamics at play so we're not causing any undue harm or stress to that kid. Okay. So before we have a little bit of time left for questions, I just want to get into some final thoughts. This is not statutory. This is really just my takeaway from doing these cases in the time that I have. It is no secret, you all who are working in this arena, you do the very hard work of working with victims who are not always giving you a high five or a hug at the end of the day. There are very little thank yous in working domestic violence cases or really child abuse cases for that matter. But it is worthy work. And so, there is no shortage of these cases that are filling your desks or your filing cabinets. And they're not going to stop. And so I hope you left today with different tools and resources to help you just work them better. Because at the end of this, we just want victims to be safe. We want offenders to be held accountable. And we want kids to grow up in a home that's free of abuse and neglect. I got to serve with CASA for a little bit on their board, and we would always say every child deserves a home that's free of abuse and neglect. And every kid has a chance, and it's you. And I always loved that saying. And so I just hope you leave today understanding that every child does have a chance, and it could be you or a member of your team. So let's give them that chance. Thank you.
Ashley, that was amazing. Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. We do have time for just a few questions. I understand that we might be able to have the opportunity to answer these questions after the recording, but just to jump to it, one of the questions was any advice on how to get detectives to want to do these FIs? As an advocate, I encourage it, but the detectives state they can't do that since the child is not the victim, or that the CPS needs to be the one to do it.
Yeah, that's such a great question. So one, detectives need to understand that it's the same as with any witness to a crime. They have the authority to try to conduct interviews with any witness of a crime. The other motivation is that one, I would explain it very much in that way. And I think that usually there's a buy-in when they understand that usually written in protocol. RCAC, their protocol allows for this to happen. When they understand that that is what it is equipped for, that's what it's built for, they feel a little bit more empowered. I think the other thing is having your prosecutor, if you work with a prosecutor regularly, having that conversation with them about the value of it to prosecution of the case. Because what I've also found is that investigators like to win their cases. And so they don't want to be up on the stand later on being cross-examined about the fact that there was a witness or information that was available to them that they just didn't seek. And so, having that conversation in more of a multidisciplinary format with a prosecutor, you, maybe even a CPS worker, and you guys kind of working hand in hand to understand the value there, I think goes a long way. And I've seen that be productive in our jurisdiction.
Awesome. Thanks for that. I think we have time for just one more. This was another question. What is the line between letting a child who is a victim or a witness from speaking too much upon law enforcement's initial arrival to where this might turn into a full interview when instead a forensic interview should be considered instead?
Yeah, that's such and it's a hard question. It's such a gray area. Again, I think that you as an officer, we never this really truly may be the only opportunity that you have to get that information from that kiddo. And your last question touched on it because it may get to the CID division and them not set up the interview. And so I think that as long as that child is still talking, even unprompted by a question, let them talk. Okay. And then once we get into talking through maybe chronological or anything like that, we probably need to stop. Once you have realized that they've witnessed something significant and you've captured that on body cam, you really need to be urging, make sure they know that they're safe, probably stopping that, no further questions after that, and getting them to that CAC. But understanding patrol officers, like you may have to be the champion for that and really explaining to your investigator that's going to get assigned, hey, this is why I think this needs to be done. And there was more there that kiddo wanted to say, but I wasn't able to get it all. I didn't want to compromise the case.
Great. Well, that looks like we're just about reaching the end of our webinar today. So please be on the lookout to receive an email later this afternoon that will explain how you can complete your evaluation form, receive your certificate of attendance, and also some contact information from our presenters. But thank you again, Ashley. Wonderful
Thank you
job. This was an
guys.
amazing webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.